Greetings and welcome to our study on Egypt's new king. Now, this may sound strange in the day and age we live in, since Egypt just elected a new president. They don't have a king, they have a new president. Now, I was reading a quote in the newspaper, and it said, after the meeting with Egypt's new Islamic president, Mohammed Morsi, in Cairo. Okay, and what I critically wanted from that quote was, they have a new president. He's an Islamic president. His name is Mohammed Morsi. Okay, so why am I talking about Egypt's new king? Well, God writes history in advance in the Bible. So Bible prophecy reveals to us that Egypt and Israel will, in the days ahead, become great friends. Now, that doesn't sound right either. That sounds really strange. How can Israel and Egypt become great friends? How can that be? How can that turn out to be the case in the future? Well, they will become great friends under a new king. Once the new king comes into play, then Israel and Egypt will be great friends, even though right now they're great enemies, and one is a Muslim country and one is a Jewish country. Now, God inspired Isaiah to write, back in the book of Isaiah, in Isaiah 19, verse 23, in that day, talking about a future day just ahead of us, in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, another way of saying Germany. And in that day, Israel will be one of three with Egypt and Assyria. A blessing in the midst of the land. You see what God is saying here in Isaiah 19:24? He's saying there's going to be three nations that throughout history have been enemies. And he's saying they're going to be a blessing in verse 25 of Isaiah 19, whom the Lord of hosts, that's Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth, the Lord of hosts will bless, saying, and this is what Jesus will be saying in the days ahead of us, blessed is Egypt, my people, which doesn't sound right now, but it will be true in the future. Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. So those three nations are all going to be working together in harmony and in unity. We also see some more in Isaiah 11 verse 9. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, in all the area that Jesus is going to be ruling over. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, meaning Jesus, the Lord Jesus, as the waters cover the sea. Verse 11. It shall come to pass in that day, in that future day, that the Lord shall set his hand. Jesus will take his hand again, the second time, it says in verse 11 of Isaiah 11, again the second time. This is a second Exodus. We've had a great Exodus. You can read about the great Exodus from Egypt, where Egypt was the enemy of Israel, and God did miracle after miracle after miracle with the first Exodus to bring the children of Israel, the nation of the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Here it says in verse 11 of Isaiah 11, he'll set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people who are left from Assyria and Egypt. He's going to gather Israel back together again, those that remain alive after the terrible days ahead, the Battle of Armageddon, and so on. Verse 12, he will set up a banner. I looked up banner in the Hebrew. It can mean a flag. We have the flag of the United States of America. It's a rallying point. It's a banner. It's an ensign. Okay? He will set up a banner or a flag for the nations and will assemble the outcasts of Israel. Those have been spread all around the world, and gather them together, the dispersed of Judah, from the four corners of the earth. Israel is soon to be captured and taken away into captivity. Now, it's been a long time that Israel has been a nation. They have fought viciously to defend their territory and protect themselves and keep themselves as a single nation. But prophecy in the Bible tells us that they will soon be captured. There will soon be a battle in Israel with Israeli soldiers losing the battle, and they will be taken into captivity. Now Jesus tells us about this in Luke 21 verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then be sure, then know, and you can be sure, that its desolation is near it. When the armies have gotten in close around the city of Jerusalem, you can know by the word of Jesus that the desolation of the Israeli people and the desolation of their capital city, their holy city, Jerusalem, is near. Verse 22. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. The historical prophecies in the Bible. Verse 23 of Luke 21. For there will be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. What land? The land of Israel. What people? The Israelis. There's going to be great wrath. Verse 24. And they will fall by the edge of the sword. What is that? In Bible language, that means they're going to die in battle. And they will be led away captive into all nations. This is going to happen in the near future. And Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles be fulfilled. And we're told in other scriptures that 3.5 years are allotted for the city of Jerusalem to be trampled under the foot of the Gentiles for 3.5 years. Now, after this happens, Jesus appears, comes in the sky, comes down from heaven, regathers his people to Jerusalem, has this second Exodus. Jesus paints this picture for us in Revelation 19:13. And he was clothed with a robe dipped in blood. This is Jesus. This is portraying himself, telling us the story. Dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. That's another name for Jesus. Verse 15. Now out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations, and he himself will rule them, the nations, with a rod of iron. Jesus is coming soon to this planet to rule all nations with a rod of iron. Verse 16 of Revelation 19. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That's another name for Jesus, isn't it? We're talking about Jesus here. King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now in Zechariah chapter 14, we see how Egypt will soon start their new king worship. Right? We've been talking about Egypt's new king. Soon they're going to start their new king worship of King Jesus. Now, if Muslims in Egypt heard this message, they'd be perplexed. They would say, we will die before we will worship the Jewish King Jesus, the Messiah Jesus, in the Jewish capital Jerusalem, in an Israeli setting. All right? But it's going to happen, and we're going to see that in that Zechariah 14. Zechariah is the second last book in the Old Testament. So if you'll turn to Zechariah chapter 14, you'll see it there. We see how Egypt will soon start their new king worship. All right, we start in verse 16 here. The whole chapter gives a description of the Battle of Armageddon, as some people call it. The true name that God gives it is the Battle of the Valley of Jehoshaphat, but a lot of people just call it the Battle of Armageddon. So let's just call it that for now. Zechariah 14:16. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations that came against Jerusalem to go let's just take that little piece of the verse. It shall come to pass that everyone who is left, those who are still left alive, after the nations came to do battle with Jesus in Jerusalem, and the Battle of Armageddon took place, and a lot of those nations that came to fight Jesus are now dead. You can see that in them. This has really got a good description of that. Their eyes dissolve in their sockets. You'll see that in chapter 14 of Zechariah. Zechariah 14 is really such a good chapter, it's almost worth memorizing it word for word. Anyhow, he says, those who are left of all the nations who came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year. So it becomes an annual event. They will go up from year to year to worship the king. You see what I'm saying? Egypt is going to have a new king, and they're going to go up to Jerusalem for king worship. Let me pick it up again in the middle of this verse. This is Zechariah chapter 14, verse 16. It says, shall go up from year to year to worship the king, the Lord of hosts. Who's that? That's Jesus. And to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, a lot of people don't know what that means, but in the old days, back in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, Jesus was keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. You just have to look it up in the concordance. And it's T-A-B-E-R. By the time you got that far, there's only a few words that start with that, and you'll find tabernacles. You can find it in the Old Testament, you can find it in the New Testament. And in Zechariah, it talks about after the Battle of Armageddon, there will be this call for nations to come to Jerusalem to worship the new king. Yes, Egypt and many, many other nations will come to worship the new king in Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles. So we go back up to verse 17 of Zechariah 14, and it shall be that whichever of the families of earth, so this is a worldwide situation, whatever families of earth do not come to Jerusalem to worship the king, the Lord of hosts, Jesus of Nazareth, on them will be no rain. Now picture Muslims trying to live out their life for a year after there is the new world capital of Jerusalem with King Jesus, a supernatural being, ruling the planet. Picture the Muslims who want to worship Allah for a whole year with no rain. What would life be like anywhere on the planet? You're trying to raise crops, you're trying to eat food, and you get no rain for a year. What is it going to be like? Would you rethink your religion? Especially since Jesus of Nazareth has captured all nations and is ruling all nations. Would you begin to rethink your religion? You would. Okay, verse 18. If the family of Egypt, right? Egypt, we're talking about Egypt. If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, not come up to Jerusalem, and not enter into this new king worship event once every year at the Feast of Tabernacles, if they will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. And they shall receive a plague with which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So, not only Egypt, we're not just talking about Egypt, we're talking about any nation that refuses to send emissaries and their leadership to the Feast of Tabernacles once every year in Jerusalem for this fabulous king worship event. Now, it's like, well, it's not exactly like the president giving the state of the nation, but it's that times 1,000 or times 100,000, because now this involves king worship, whereas just hearing the state of the nation from the president just involves a man painting a picture of where we've come, where we are now, and where we're going. Verse 18. Okay. We read verse 18, verse 19. This shall be the punishment of Egypt. So, if Egypt doesn't accept its new king, if Egypt doesn't come for king worship at the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem every year, this will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations that do not come to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So, what do we have? Soon, Egypt and all nations will be learning to worship King Jesus. Now, if anyone wants to be with King Jesus in the first resurrection, anyone right now, they need to be worshiping King Jesus right now.